Paul said in Galatians 2:20, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So we're going to be talking about what is the crucified with Christ life. What exactly is meant by Paul saying, I am crucified with Christ? Galatians 2:20 is a pretty popular verse, but I perceive, and what I see is that most people, they miss what exactly Paul's saying when he says he's crucified with Christ. What exactly does that mean? You see, some people believe that being crucified with Christ is just the idea that, you're positionally dead to sins and you're alive to God. But did Paul believe that his crucifixion with Christ was something that had nothing to do with whether he behaved right or wrong? Can you still be crucified with Christ and still be a sinner? That's what we're going to be talking about here. So most people miss this point. Galatians 2:20 is a verse at the end of Paul's speech to Peter. So to understand what exactly Galatians 2:20 is, of course it's very important to understand the context directly before it. What did Paul say directly before this? So, starting in verse 11, Paul's words to Peter. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, inasmuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. So here we see that Peter had, whether purposely or not, he had influenced the Gentiles to live like a Jew. Whether he meant to or not, it doesn't really matter. Peter, the way he was behaving at this time, it called Paul to rebuke him for making it out that you have to be like a Jew to be saved. So Paul is coming against Peter here and reminding him, preaching to him, telling him publicly before all that it's not by the works of the law that a man is justified. So here's Paul's words to Peter. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly, according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew, livest after the manner of the Gentiles, not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So this is Paul's point here. Peter, you can't revert back and think that you have to be circumcised. You can't think you have to obey all the Jewish customs in order to be justified. That Paul is telling him, reminding him, this is something that Peter should have known at this point. Peter should have known this. This was clear doctrine for the church at the time, and which, there's room for debate whether Peter was going about this intentionally or not. But either way, Paul is wanting to be sure here that you understand that you're not just justified by the works of the law, circumcision, obeying Sabbaths, dietary laws, things such as that. So this is why, this is Paul's reasoning. Here Paul's reasoning for why you can't be justified by the works of the law and while you're in Christ. Verse 17, but if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. Hear those words. Hear those words. What is Paul's understanding of himself at this time? He says, Peter, if while we seek to be justified by Christ, so if we're saying we're Christians, if we're saying we're justified by Christ, yet you have to obey the works of the law, then you make yourself a transgressor. This is Paul clearly showing us that he did not think he was a sinner at this time. I know a lot of you probably think that, Paul said he was a chief of sinners. Paul said in Romans 7 he does that which he hates. But You cannot deny this verse is teaching. Paul did not think he was a sinner. He said, if I build again the things which I destroyed, so if he's saying I bring all these customs, these laws of Moses on myself and say that I must be circumcised, I must obey dietary laws, I must reverence all Sabbaths to the letter of the law, he's saying I would become a transgressor. I would make myself a transgressor. That's like me saying right now, I would make myself a human if I could make myself a human. Of course, I'm a human now. I can't make myself a human. If Paul was a sinner, if Paul sinned every day, like a lot of you may believe, how can he say, if I done this, I would make myself a transgressor? See, you must first not be something to become something. Paul believed he was not a sinner. He was righteous in Christ. He believed being a sinner and being in Christ were incompatible. That was the problem with what Peter's teaching here. Paul knew that the law in the Old Testament, the Mosaic law, was impossible to keep to the letter. It couldn't be what justified you, because he understood that Christ came to deliver from sin. And if sin is impossible to avoid, if you're made a transgressor and you're saying you're in Christ, then you're making Christ the minister of sin. Listen to Galatians 2:20, 19 through 20. This is Paul. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. But the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So Paul said, Christ lives in him. If Paul is sinning, then Christ is sinning. That's his argument. That's his logic. You cannot be a sinner and be in Christ. That's his crux of his argument. That's why you can't say you have to keep the Mosaic law, because everybody knows it's impossible to keep to the letter exactly. There's no point. There's no point in even trying. And it was never meant to justify you. It's always been love God and your neighbor as yourself. That's always been justification. That's always been what it took. God never required people to keep the letter of the Mosaic law to be righteous before him. That's a crazy argument. God never made that case. The Old Testament had its purposes, and it was not that you had to keep everything to the letter to be righteous with God. And Paul understood this. He's saying, if we say that you have to do those things, if we must obey the Jewish customs to the letter to be right with God, then he would become a transgressor. He would be a sinner. And that is what he says, God forbid. God forbid that I should seek to be justified by Christ. God forbid that I should say I'm a Christian and a sinner. God forbid. God forbid that. But what do you hear people saying today? What do you hear almost every Christian saying on the street? What do you hear almost every Christian in the pulpit saying? I sin every day. See, there's no problem with that statement in a lot of today's churches. But Paul said, God forbid that I should be a sinner and seek to be justified by Christ. God forbid. But today, it's the opposite way. Today, it's God forbid that you should say you're not a sinner. God forbid that you should actually be righteous in Christ. But that's not the case, folks. You can't be a sinner and in Christ. Galatians 2, 17 through 20, one more time. Hear Paul's argument here. What is the problem with saying you have to be under Moses' law while also being justified by Christ? Why is that a problem? Listen to what's his point here? But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness came by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. The reason Jesus came is that he might destroy the works of the devil. He came that we might fulfill the righteousness of the law. So of course, sin and being in Christ is completely incompatible. completely incompatible. If you're in sin, if you're a sinner, you're not in Christ. And if you say you are, you're making Christ the minister of sin. You're ascribing sin to Christ, because the Christian is Christ living in them. That's what Paul said. If you're truly crucified with Christ, if you're like Paul said in Galatians 5:24, they that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If you're a real Christian, you have crucified the flesh. You have put to death the deeds of the body to live. Sin and being in Christ is incompatible. You cannot be a sinner and a Christian at the same time. God bless.